Honestly, in 95% of cases, it is an absolute slam dunk. This is a criminal.
So first up, we have a story that was reading from the Telegraph, but I was on holiday. This was the thing that when I took a sneak peek of what was going on Twitter, first on Watchdog. It was Monzo now have their say following the BBC's highlight of a pretty critical Watchdog attack. So for listeners abroad or who just didn't pick that up, Watchdog is a BBC programme which seeks to expose what it sees as malpractice in companies across the UK. Last week it highlighted Monzo in particular to dig into how they do AML. No Monzo spokesperson was directly quoted in the film itself, or there was some rather snazzy ice work on show at one point. Monzo say they are in line with AML practices at work in UK banks, and nothing that was highlighted in the programme is unusual, even if it was portrayed in not such a good light in the programme. So, we could probably have a good stab at talking about this one, but we thought we'd probably bring somebody in who knows a lot more about it than us. So introducing Tom Bonfield, who is the Monzo CEO. How's it going, Tom?
It's going very well, thank you. Glad to be here.
I was on a sun lounger when all this kind of happened last week, but I guess, unfortunately, you weren't available to talk to them, right?
I had just been in hospital for some knee surgery, which went well. I'm back off the crutches now. Yeah, I was under the knife.
Something serious, like a ACL or something? Or?
I tore my meniscus playing squash about 3 or 4 years ago. It's a horrible injury, so I'm just trying to get that repaired.
Ouch. All right. Well, it wasn't just the running repairs on your knees that you sort of came in to have a chat about, but this was a bit of a surprise, I have to say, definitely from my perspective. But you guys clearly didn't get any warning that this was coming from Watchdog's perspective?
We did get warning, and we provided comment. I'm not sure the whole of our comment was reproduced, but we did provide comment.
Okay. And, do you feel there's been sort of a rise of more scrutiny around actually what's happened in this sense? Or, how do you think the portrayal was, and, what's your sort of response, I guess, in terms of the things that Watchdog highlighted?
So I'd step back from that particular program and talk about the issue more broadly, which is there has been a big rise in bank fraud, in authorised push payment in particular. And there's been a lot of criticism that banks aren't doing enough to combat that, including the week before on that same show, saying banks aren't doing enough to fight this. And so we have a set of obligations to detect and prevent financial crime, money laundering and fraud in particular. And I believe we have very, very robust technology that is actually very good at spotting suspicious behaviour. And then we have a set of obligations under the law to report those to the authorities and to exit those accounts. And so we have to balance that with also treating customers fairly, especially treating legitimate customers fairly and not inconveniencing people unnecessarily. And the whole thing is complicated even further by a prohibition on tipping off, which is basically if you suspect someone of money laundering, you cannot tell them in case you jeopardize a criminal investigation effectively. And so we're sort of we're trying to balance these two things, fighting financial crime with treating legitimate customers fairly and not inconveniencing them, whilst having almost our voice gagged by this prohibition on tipping off. And it's very tricky because we see fraudsters, like any bank, who will use the accounts and they will commit, they'll go and scam other people at other banks and sometimes use Monzo to move funds through. And we have very, very good ways of detecting that, and we shut the accounts down. And then very often, those people will go on social media and start screaming about it. They will contact me directly, and in every case, I look into it. And honestly, in 95% of cases, it is an absolute slam dunk. This is a criminal. And they come up with heartbreaking stories. I can't feed my children. I'm going to be made homeless. You've done this to me. And I'm sitting there looking at the police report, explaining exactly where the money's come from, going, this is totally incongruous. The BBC came to us with a large number of cases, and we looked into all of them. And without crossing line over tipping off, I'm very confident in the decisions we're making here.
Yeah.
But it's very, very tricky for us to go and justify it on a case-by-case basis. Am I saying that we have never got this wrong ever? Absolutely not. There will be cases where we inconvenience legitimate customers and we will get it wrong. And and that's a risk of doing business. But overwhelmingly, I think we get this right. So it is hard to face those kind of stories in the press. It's really, really hard for us to respond. I mean, we put a blog post out basically outlining this.
Yeah. I mean, AML globally is a massive problem because, to your point, this is not a small thing. The money that's actually being used in many of these instances is being used for reasonably horrific things in society. So actually taking a more technologically advanced approach to dealing with this and dealing with it rather than actually not dealing with it and allowing actually the cost of that just to be swallowed up in society seems like a sensible thing to do. But I mean, you're in a bit of a rock and a hard place here. Is you can't necessarily talk about it in a specific sense, but actually you're in a situation where you feel confident in the processes and the technology that you've got in place to deal with it.
We do, and I've reviewed it personally. We've had our internal risk and compliance teams review our decision-making process. A recent review saw that in 95% of cases, we were absolutely confident in our decision. And in 5% of cases, it's just a question mark. There's a judgment call where there's a set of behaviours that could indicate money laundering and fraud or could not. But in 95% of cases, we were confident in our response. I think we do flag more accounts because the technology we're using is actually better at finding this stuff. And so it's incredibly frustrating because we do a lot of really, really good work to return millions of pounds to victims of fraud. We've been very heavily involved in tracking down and then prosecuting human trafficking cases, in cases of sexual slavery. Really, really gruesome, horrible stuff that I'm incredibly proud that we're working to prevent. And it's very frustrating when you get known criminals, known fraudsters taking to social media, slinging mud.
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I think from a fraud or money laundering perspective, arguably are we at a stage now where, I mean, to a certain degree, this is a sign of success to a certain degree because, I mean, HSBC has always been put up as the biggest opportunity to go after for any element of these things because of the sheer payoff for it. But now you're at a point where you've got how many customers?
3.2 million.
Then actually, is this part of sort of doing business that you're facing into here where, I mean, you've been such a, I guess, from the way in which you talk to consumers, the way in which you communicate with the community, the way in which you're sort of setting yourself out. Is this now, I guess, a sign of the times to a certain degree where we're getting to a point where the things that would be thrown at a HSBC or a Barclays, the media are seeing you in a similar light, therefore, from Watchdog's perspective, Lloyds Banking Group or you or whoever you're a bank. Yeah,
and in a sense, it is a testament to our success that we have grown to a point where we're becoming a mainstream bank, and that is something we are proud of. I think, again, stepping back, I think there is this interesting trend in UK media, and you see it with celebrities, you see it with sports people, musicians, and startups, where you spend a year or two really building this stuff, these people, these companies up, really. And the first 2 or 3 years, we benefited from that. We saw some amazingly positive, even euphoric coverage. We could do no wrong for a period of time. And then there's a tipping point when you're big enough to then tear down, that everyone just flips. And so I actually don't think either are justified. Like anyone, like any company, any person, there are things we do really well and there are things we're not so good at. We make mistakes. And so probably the euphoric early press was overblown. But I really feel with some publications in the last 6 or 9 months, you can go and read just a string of headlines that if they were true, Monzo would have failed by now. And that is not true.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be an interesting sort of bias there of not just with you guys, but actually with a number of them where I think fintech has got to that scale where now it's not just the plucky underdog, it's actually a target for people. I mean, how much are you concerned about that? Because I guess we're in a sense where, you guys have now done TV adverts and, you're becoming more mainstream essentially. I would have a concern that my mum might not have seen a TV ad, but she might watch Watchdog. So, is there a risk here that this could have a detrimental impact, not just for you guys, but actually for the industry as a whole?
I think there is a risk, but on balance, I think most of the reporting is balanced, actually. I think it is really a great thing. We have a free press that scrutinizes all industries, not just ours. And I think so overall that is a very, very positive thing. I think I hope that this is a sort of a blip, an aberration, but yeah, there is a risk if it continues and if it amplifies that, it causes damage not just to us but the industry.
What do you guys think? Sort of opening up to the rest of you guys, it seems like quite an interesting one. And I mean, I was definitely enthralled watching it from the Sunlander in Rhodes. But what about you guys?
Yeah, I think you could write that story about any bank. You know, it wasn't unique to Monzo. So I watched the program, and I think the subjects they brought up, or the topics, apply to most financial institutions. So I agree with Tom. As a licensed regulated institution, you're in that difficult space where you can't tip off and you have to treat people fairly. I think the problem is as a new company, whether you're a fintech company or payments company as we are, you are a target of fraudsters. They do want to move money around the world, so they will target new companies. We, as much as Monzo or MasterCard, have very strong fraud controls in our business to stop these payments. So yes, you can say, my account was cancelled. There's probably a reason behind that. So I didn't see it as an attack on Monzo. I mean, you can write that about any bank, really.
Yeah. I mean, there's a real point there about just because somebody complains doesn't necessarily mean it is valid.
No.
And actually, to your point, Tom, there's a lot of what seemingly sound like very good stories kind of put alongside criminals are probably one of the most entrepreneurial people that there are. So, coming up with a decent backstory for these things are not necessarily unexpected to a certain degree. What do you think?
Yeah, no, and it's very interesting. What I picked up from what Tom was saying is very interesting, the different point of view of the media before and after. So when the company is growing, you can do no wrong, versus when the company is bigger and established, it's all about the negative aspect. And obviously, for us, we have a very close relation with Monzo, so we work with Monzo a lot. And I have to say, it is true that Monzo, with their own technology, they can actually find out things much faster than other issuers. And that puts them sometimes on the spotlight for the right reason, for the wrong reason, just because they are ahead of finding out issues that they report to us and to some of their partners. So I think it's because of that position, I think they should continue leveraging it. And it doesn't matter. The media will say what they say, but I think the fintech world and Monzo, they're doing an amazing service to actually the community. So
I'm sure, like you say, there's 5% of these things where essentially if you're in a situation where it is a real issue, it's a system being overzealous in some instance. But I guess these are fine-tuning points that you need to do continually, and I guess the more data you have in these instances, the better you're going to get at actually doing these things. But I mean, dealing with that when that happens, I guess, is the critical thing, because not everybody who has a bad story is legitimate, but equally some people are going to get caught up in the mix here, right? Yeah,
and that is the issue. It's the grey area, and it's not even. I think there will always be some zone of uncertainty, and honestly you're talking about 5%, where the automated system has flagged it and said have a look at it, and a human goes in and you just have to make a judgment call. You've got someone saying, this person promised to sell me a car on eBay, I sent them money, the car never, there was no car, it was a total scam, and the other person is saying the opposite, but no, this was legitimate, I did, and you've got to make a call there. There is, ultimately, you're making hard choices, hard sort of decisions in ambiguous situations. But honestly, in 90 or 95% of cases, it's so black and white from our perspective that we're confident in our decisions. And the inventiveness, the stories that some criminals will come up with are heart-wrenching. But you sort of, and I've done this repeatedly, you have the data, the evidence, and unfortunately, the rules we can't share because they make them less effective, but we have all of the rules that indicate why we so strongly believe this is a criminal versus their story. And it's laughable because it's like night and day. But there will always be the kind of judgment area, and we will get it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think getting licensed as a bank or a payment company is so difficult and such a long process. I don't think new fintechs have the same maybe luxury of a bank that's been around for 150 years. If you get it wrong, then you're not going to get just a slap on the wrist, probably more severe consequences. So you also have to protect your business. And if it is a grey area or a case where you're not really sure on, sometimes it's better to err on the side of caution, because you can't acquire customers at all costs or acquire customers which aren't appropriate for your business.
Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of criminals who are not being picked up by other systems who are not having to complain on social media to a certain degree, right? So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? So just because you're not hearing the noise about it doesn't mean it's not actually being or it probably means it's not being addressed rather than the fact that it is. You know?
Absolutely. And I totally agree. I mean, if you think fighting fraud is one of the biggest challenges for the payment industry, I mean, and even larger issuers, larger banks, they haven't nailed it. Nobody can be an expert. Where it's really powerful is where, as an industry, we come together with solutions that ultimately will require a judgment call at some point. But if the right tools are in place and the right processes are in place, that's when the industry is effective at fighting fraud and hopefully reducing it.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. I think the confirmation of payee system, which should be live by March of next year, is a really positive step forward for the industry that should actually reduce fraud overall. I think there's a report coming out, and it may be out by the time this podcast is aired, from the Treasury Select Committee looking at this exact issue and sort of a range of measures. But confirmation of payee, I think, will be a real step forward in the fight against authorised push payment.
Just unpack slightly. So for an international audience, what does that mean? What will that do?
So at the moment, the way a typical authorised push payment fraud will take place is that you might be a Monzo customer or a Lloyds Bank customer or whatever, and you receive a phone call, and the person on the other end of the phone line says, "This is Lloyd's fraud department, Monzo fraud department. I have to tell you, your account is under attack, is in jeopardy. People are trying to get in. The money's not left yet, but you need to do something about it. Do you have a safe account?" And the person will say, "Well, what's a safe account?" So another account with different in a different place that's you can move the money into to protect it. You say, "No, I've not got one of those." And the person on the phone will say, "No problem. I'll set you up a safe account right now. And all you have to do is move money from this account into the safe account, and you can be sure it's your account because put your own name in the recipient field. And, that will ensure that it's going to yourself." Of course, people who are familiar with the financial services industry know for a faster payment that you can put whatever junk you want in that name field. Honestly, most banks don't do anything with it at all, and so confirmation of payee is a system that allows the sending bank to take that name field, make a request to the recipient bank and say, "My customer thinks they're sending money to Joe Bloggs. Is this Joe Bloggs' account?" And the recipient bank will respond, "Yes, it is," or "No, it absolutely isn't," or "This is a sort of partial match. It's J Bloggs, so probably close enough." That allows you to flag up to the person, "Look, you think you're sending it to Joe Bloggs. This really isn't Joe Bloggs. Please take care." So I think that will help in that category. The unfortunate thing is criminals and fraudsters are so inventive that there will be a new scam next with a different script. But this script is unfortunately very, very effective at the moment. It's where a lot of particularly older and more vulnerable people are being fooled.
I think that's really difficult, isn't it? I suppose what we've seen in the advertising from the banks and this year is all about, fraud, don't trust anyone, didn't give your password out over the phone. And for those of us who work in financial services, you would never do it. If my credit card company calls me, I now hang up and I call them back, because now I'm overcautious, because now I think, I don't know who that guy is. So I think it does help, but as you say, there are always going to be new ways of defrauding people. It's how we, I suppose, fight or mitigate that.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, criminals are rather entrepreneurial, aren't they? But
but they've got a good business, eh? So they need to
stay ahead of the trends.
Exactly, yeah.
I guess, is there anything, you guys are so privileged to have the opportunity to communicate with your customers in a different way to many banks. So do you have an opportunity to try and educate people about on these risks in a way that's sort of above and beyond what the rest of the industry is doing?
It's tricky, honestly. I think you can educate all you want, and we try to do it. But I think doing work to make the whole system less susceptible to fraud is the ultimate solution here. Not expecting customers are going to be socially engineered and manipulated. They have been for the entire of history. That will continue to be true forever. I think using technology and data in a smart way to actually reduce the amount of fraud in the system is the only way forwards on this. In particular, I think a system that allows the banks to coordinate their response much, much faster. To be able to say, my customer's been scammed, and shut down the recipient account and any other further recipient account very, very quickly. Just a sort of stop button that freezes the chain of accounts. And it might be across 5 or 6 separate banks. At the moment, the way this works for some banks is they'll send a fax, and the fax might get picked up a week later. And by that time, the money is long gone. So I think basically a centralized sort of system for locking down accounts for review and then return of funds is I can see the industry moving towards that over the next few years.
I mean, I think the major difficulty there, I was at the FCA Tech Sprint recently that was all about AML, and actually the difficulty that, I mean, you have talking to another organization is the way in which they do fraud mechanisms and risk. And, fraud really is a business decision at this stage in terms of where people are, and people make very different decisions to one another. I don't think interbank profiles for risk works, because I don't think banks will trust other people's views on what risk is. And it's really interesting. I think to your point, you do need some singular central unit to do this thing really, really effectively, because actually then it's not about you working closely with Lloyd's and you trusting their risk policy or them trusting your risk policy, but actually that there becomes more of a unified standards for these types of things in the way that there is in many other instances. You wouldn't expect you and Barclays to have a completely different setup for what payments are. So why do we expect it with the other things that are in there?
I think everyone thinks they've got the best risk policy, right? Everyone's going to say their risk policy is the best in the market. And I don't
know. I'm not sure how many of them do, if I'm honest with you. So, but to my point, I think it's an accepted sort of risk of business that they have, and actually, given the scale in many instances, then it's just one that they have. I think the other thing to element of this is like we're perversely in a world where digital is facilitating just a completely different, front door to banking. It used to be it was a burly set of people in front of a vault. That was fraud management essentially. They probably had a shotgun as well. So now we're in a system where actually banks are having to be much, much, much more sophisticated around technology, and maybe they're just not quite at that game yet in terms of the level of losses, the level of risk, because it's only 1% globally of AML that's actually being picked up in totality. That is shocking. When you look at, to your point, Tom, all of the things that this money is being used for, it's not, somebody scamming 600 or 700 quid out of a thing. It's like actually human trafficking, and to your point. So it's a problem that really, really needs to be addressed. But I think it actually requires not only the banks, but the media to be probably on the right side of this one to a certain degree.
Yeah, I agree. The final thing I would mention is the contingent reimbursement model, and particularly the proposals at the moment for a sort of industry-wide levy. So the big campaign from which basically says these customers are being scammed and in some cases suffering life-changing losses, and the bank should be on the hook for that, which I don't disagree with, actually. I think if the customer's done everything they can to protect themselves and taken reasonable steps, actually the bank should step in and make those customers whole. The problem at the moment is that there is a proposal that every bank will basically pay a levy into a central pot that will be used for that. And if you imagine take polluting factories as an analogy. You've got 9 old factories that are all pumping pollution into the river. And then you've got a new technology-enabled factory that is actually much less polluting. And a regulator or the whole industry says, well, to clean up this pollution, we're going to put a levy on everyone. The problem is you have this sort of externality problem that even if you reduce your fraud to 0, it's only going to reduce the whole pool by 10%, and you're still funding everyone else's pollution. And so at Monzo, we absolutely support refunding customers, but we'd refund our own customers because in many instances, our fraud rates are 4 or 5 times lower than industry. Whereas for a big bank like Barclays or HSBC, it's a tiny, tiny cost of doing business. Yeah. For us, it's absolutely game-changing in terms of the economic consequences of having to fund Barclays or HSBC's fraud losses.
Yeah, I mean, it could fundamentally change the operating cost of the whole of the organisation. So hopefully they're going to make that proportionate rather than just a blanket setup. But I guess we'll find out a lot more about that at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the proposal is a flat fee per payment with no risk rating on how much fraud you are exposed to or create.
Let's hope that doesn't happen. All right. On that note then, Tom, thanks very much for coming in. Appreciate you taking the time to come and say hey.
Thanks for having me.